Okay, so I slightly altered the topic a little bit, kind of providentially. When I came up with this list of topics, I didn't necessarily realize today was Christ the King. So what I decided to do is just, we'll still talk about, originally we were supposed to talk about church and state. We'll still talk about that, but I want to come at it from a different angle. And come at it from the kingship of Christ. Given that that's the feast day today, and there's always graces from reflecting on what it means and what it doesn't mean. Okay, so today's gospel. Okay, today's gospel, at least part of it, is Jesus before Pilate, and Pilate asks him if he's a king, and Jesus answers, "My kingdom does not belong to this world. If my kingdom did belong to this world, my attendants would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not here." So Pilate said to him, "Then you are a king." And Jesus answered, "You say I am a king. For this I was born. For this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." Okay, so what does Jesus mean when he says, "My kingdom is not of this world"? Does it mean that it's completely otherworldly, or does it mean it's unlike any other kingdom in this world? So present, but in a different way than earthly kingdoms tend to look like. Yes. Yeah. So when we say something like it's unlike the other kingdoms of the world, it's really a kingdom that has a foundation in another world, but infects this world. Yes, Connor.
When he says, "You say I'm the king, for this I was born, for this I came into the world," what is this? Testify to the truth, or is that to be
Well, what does Gabriel tell Mary about? He only tells her one thing really about Jesus, right? Other than that he's the Son of the Most High. He will sit on the throne of David, right? So the throne of David is not necessarily a heavenly kingdom, it's an earthly kingdom. And so there's something in there about, and this is what we're going to unpack, the relationship between church and state, where authority lies, where it comes from, and all of that. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to first talk about the feast day, why the feast day is, and then from that, hopefully get us begin to think about principles. Remember last week at the end when I kind of went on my rant about making sure that like we're based solid Catholic principles, and then we go in and infect the world with it, right? And affect everything in the world. That's the general idea. Okay, so Pius the 11th in 1925 instituted the Feast of Christ the King. And he instituted it through this encyclical called Quas Primas. And so the church institutes feasts normally for a couple of reasons. The first is it's the principle that how we worship is how we believe and what we believe, right? So it lex orandi, lex credandi, right? So what and how we worship affects what and how we believe, but what and how we worship also forms what we believe, right? So in a certain sense, the liturgy is a manner in which God reveals to us. And so what Pius XI was seeing was this movement in the world towards completely and totally secular kingdoms, right? And secular is not necessarily a bad thing, it just means things of this world. But completely and totally secular kingdoms means that they're completely and totally without God. And so in order to combat that, well, he does what the church does. He instituted a feast so that first he could change people's beliefs and understanding about it, or at least awaken it, but also he could call down graces to transform the thing, right? He's infecting right belief, and he's bringing down graces. Okay, so maybe today, I don't know, maybe at Mass, you heard a homily about Christ being the King of all of our hearts, or at least you've heard that before in Christ the King. How many of you heard that before? Totally true. Totally true. But that is not the only way in which Christ reigns, because the feast is Christ, the King of the universe, right? The whole thing, right? Not like King in absentia in heaven, not just King of our hearts. But certainly the reign goes from our hearts. But can Jesus reign in our hearts without reigning in the world? Maybe not, right? Okay, so that title of king, remember at the end of Matthew's gospel, right? What does Jesus tell the apostles? He says, all power in heaven and on earth is given to me. So all power, all authority was given to Christ. So he is ruler of both heaven and earth. And so that title of king certainly is metaphorical in the sense of reigning over our hearts, but it also is literal. Okay. And so because even if it's just reigning in our hearts, we're social creatures, right? We've talked about this semester. And so him reigning in our hearts has social consequences. All right, so maybe a visual will help a little bit to kind of at least launch us. Okay, so I stole this out of a really old book because nobody actually talks about this anymore. So this is the kingship of Christ. And notice how it breaks it off into two branches, okay? The spiritual and the temporal, right? And his spiritual kingship is exercised through the church, right? Delegated from him to the Pope and the bishops in the church. But yet he's still a king, and he's king of this world. And so he's also ruling in the world. So all authority in the world, every authority that any ruler has, comes from Christ. So just let that sink in for just a second, because then you realize there's a lot of consequences to that. Because if he is actually the source of authority, then what should temporal rulers or temporal governments actually look like? And what makes them legitimate and what makes them not? And that's what we're going to talk about. So think of, again, going back to what I said, think of that interaction between church and state as the two ways in which Christ reigns. And he reigns through spiritual authority in one realm or in one way through the church, and then through his temporal authority through this, we'll call it the state for now. All right, so that being said, we have to know this a little bit. This idea is countercultural even as Catholics. So what I want to do is just back up for just a second and read this quote from Cardinal Pie, who you'll notice most of what I kind of quote from today is from most of the 3 or 4 popes of the late 19th century, early 20th century, because they are the ones who sort of began to wrestle with this a little bit about the implications of it. And Cardinal Pie was a cardinal in the church under Pius X, and he wrote pretty extensively on the reign of Christ the King in the temporal realm. So here's what he said. And I really want to talk about this because this to me changes the way I think about, or at least the way I thought about it. If we suppose Catholic social institutions with our Lord no longer living in the hearts of the individual members of society, then religion is merely a signboard which will soon disappear. Okay, so reign in the hearts, right? Really important, right? Can't do without it. If we assume that it means nothing, that Christ is, it's just a religious thing, then pretty soon the religious thing will pass away. But on the other hand, try to convert individuals without Catholicizing the social institutions, and your work is without stability. So again, trying to convert individuals without Catholicizing the social institutions, and your work is without stability. Why is that true? Why is it true that if we do not Catholicize the institutions, and not just institutions like from the family to the state and everything in between. Why is that almost self-destructive? Go ahead, Con. Yeah, it undoes everything you're trying to do, right? It undoes everything you're trying to do, right? Think about it. How many people are pro-choice just simply because it's legal? A lot, right? Because the law is a moral teacher, right? So it's really hard to tell someone about the dignity of human life when they look and the laws say, well, actually, that's not true, right? Then you might even convert them to that, but then the social institutions undo that. So what he's saying is it's almost impossible to evangelize when the social institutions are essentially set to undermine what you're doing. Think about, why do most people say something like, I don't know, stealing is wrong? Well, because it's illegal. But then people might think, well, some lying is okay because it's not illegal. All of those things, right? So all the moral aspects of it, not to mention when they're set up such that God is not even in the picture. So one of the, again, providentially, this is why the popes spoke on this, because the 1930s especially, there was a Marxist movement in the world. And there were Marxists, one of them was Herbert Marcuse, who came up with the idea that if you make the slow march through the institutions, then you can make the world Marxist. So what he meant is start taking over institutions. So what did they do? Well, they started in the United States. They went to Columbia College, where all the teachers were being formed, and they infected Columbia's Teachers College, right? John Dewey, everyone heard of John Dewey? Okay, so John Dewey is like where we get the Dewey Decimal System. He's the father of American education. He's a Marxist. Yeah. So what they did is they strategically infected all the institutions, right? And now what are we living in? We're living in where that march is almost complete, right? So pick an institution that hasn't been infected by Marxism. It's really hard, right? So that's just this principle in reverse, right? Because what happened is Catholics stopped being Catholics and infecting and letting their faith inform what they were doing. Right? They ceased to recognize Christ as king of the temporal reign. All right. So again, my soapbox moment last week was to exhort all of you to be like Joseph and Esther. Right? What did they do? They went in and infected like corrupt institutions and changed them. All right. So the point then is Christ's reign in the temporal and spiritual realm. There's two separate, we'll call them two separate kingdoms, kingdom in this world and kingdom in the next world, but they have to be pulling in the same direction. Okay. Yes.
Do you think with regard to these sorts of formation or reformation of social institutions?
Deformation.
Yeah. Well, so I guess moving forward, so do you think that Gnosticism, not in the sense of like religious belief, but in the sense of like neutrality is a valid path forward? Because I hear people say, you know, oh, we need to stop, you know, let's get ideology, or let's just let's reform the schools so they don't teach theories of anything, basically. Just teach them, just educate them. Don't indoctrinate them.
Yeah.
It's kind of
Yeah. So can you actually be neutral on any question?
I don't think so.
Why not?
Because all truth is connected.
Yeah. So in a certain respect, right? Like when I'm neutral, I'm actually saying something, right? Even when I'm neutral, like the question of, like let's say even on the question of abortion, like for the state to remain neutral on that question is essentially saying that it's up to the individual to decide what's true, right? So it's a veiled subjectivism, right? And then it eventually becomes a victim of the democratic mob, right? And so then you just infect the democratic mob, and then you have it, right? And we're going to talk about this a little bit in the end, Governments can't be neutral on religion either. Right? That's the great like American myth, and we're going to talk about that at the end. But you can imagine after what I just said why that might be the case. Okay. Okay, so set up the way it's supposed to work is the secular and we'll call it the secular and the spiritual have to be pulling in the same direction so that the secular sets up no obstacles in the way of a person's salvation. Right? And this is how it worked for a really long time. Okay, from about the year 800 to I don't know, at least 800 years, like as Christendom began to sort of blossom, right? Church and state separate, but pulling in the same direction, both working for the salvation of souls, right? The state can't save the souls, only the church can do that. But the state can certainly remove some of the obstacles that might lead to the loss of souls, right? And make it conducive to that. And we can talk about some principles towards the end of what that would look like. But the point is, when the state ceases to do that, then souls are lost. And that's what Cardinal PA is saying. All right, so at the beginning of the encyclical, Pope Pius XI says the chief causes of the difficulties under which mankind was laboring, he's looking backwards, and the manifold evils in the world were due to the fact that the majority of men had thrust Jesus Christ and his holy law out of their lives. Okay, reign in the heart. That these had no place either in private affairs or in politics. And we said further that as long as individuals and states refused to submit to the rule of our Savior, there would really be no hopeful prospect of a lasting peace among nations. Okay, so what is he saying there, right? He's saying that if Christians, which it tends to be this way, like remain neutral on politics, then eventually it will affect the church, right? So Christians can't be neutral on politics, right? That's why it's a moral. Everything political is moral. And a lot of times people go, well, I don't want to get involved. It's a mess, right? And so guess what? The people who want to get involved in it and don't mind the mess, they take it over. And then God is eventually thrust out. Okay, so where do temporal rulers get their authority from? All right, let's ask our Lord. Same gospel from today. So Pilate said to him, do you not speak to me? This is when Jesus is remaining silent. Do you not know that I have the power to release you and I have the power to crucify you? Jesus answered him. Notice he didn't say you don't have the power. What does he say? He says, that power you have came from above. You would have no power over me if it had not been given to you from above. For this reason, the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin. Okay, so Jesus doesn't deny the power that was given to Pilate, or that Pilate had the authority to put him to death, right? And in fact, he even says that the Jews, for handing him over who lacked the authority, were actually wrong, where Pilate is at least exercising legitimate authority, even though unjustly. But he has the authority to do that. So let's talk about civil authority then. Leo the 13th, Immortality Dei, follows that all public power must proceed from God. For God alone is the true and supreme Lord of the world. Everything without exception must be subject to him and must serve him, so that whosoever holds the right to govern holds it from one sole and single source, namely God, the sovereign ruler of all. There is no power but from God. All right, so civil government is, again, distinct, but not necessarily separate. And it's aiming at the temporal good, but that temporal good is always, always, always subordinate to the good of salvation, right? So what do we believe in the United States? Does anyone know where power comes from? Does anyone know, have you ever studied popular sovereignty? Does anyone know what that is? Yeah, so let's talk about where that actually comes from. So Pope St. Pius X said that every social ill stemmed from a heresy. So he would say that, okay, where does popular sovereignty come from? Well, we're gonna blame the Protestants, right? So let's talk about it. So that idea that authority comes from above, uniquely Catholic. Like no one in the United States believe that, no Protestants believe that, only Catholics believe that. Sudden uprisings and the boldest rebellions immediately followed in Germany. So he's talking about the fallout from the Reformation. Followed in Germany, the so-called Reformation, the authors and leaders of which by their new doctrines attacked at the very foundation of religious, not just religious, but also civil authority. And this was so fearful an outburst of civil war with such slaughter that there was scarcely any place free from tumult and bloodshed. From this heresy, Protestant heresy, there arose in the last century a false philosophy, a new right, as it's called, and a popular authority, together with an unbridled license, which many regard as the only true liberty. Hence, we have reached the limit of horrors, to wit, communism, socialism, nihilism, hideous deformities of the civil society of men, and almost in ruin. Okay, why is he blaming Protestants? Is he just like kick a Protestant while they're down? Like, why is he blaming Protestants? Go ahead, Connor. Yeah, so there are consequences of individual and private judgment, right? Because if God can't work through the Pope, well, he also can't work through the temporal ruler, right? If I am the interpreter of all that God is saying and doing, then actually authority has to flow through me. So rather than coming from above, it comes from below, right? Does that make sense? Like a lot of the ills that we suffer socially come from the simple Protestant heresy with the rejection of the authority of the church. So once you eliminate the spiritual kingship of Christ through the church, it's only inevitable that the temporal rulers also are undermined. And in so doing, if the authority comes from below, and we somehow give them authority, then their authority actually extends beyond just the temporal. All right, so it's a two-step process, right? So if I have elected someone and the people have spoken, I have handed over my authority to them, just like God normally would, right? And if I hand my authority over to them and the church has no authority, they become the supreme authority. Does everyone follow that? Why that happens? Okay. And so eventually, right, what do they do in Germany? Well, they're like, well, the religion of the ruler is the religion, right? Because the ruler has supreme. So authority, there's when there's a vacuum, something will fill it. Okay, so there's never a vacuum. All right, so let's talk about what Luther says. Between the Christian and the ruler, a profound separation must be made. This ought to begin to sound familiar. Assuredly, a prince can be a Christian, but it is not as a Christian that he ought to govern. How that is possible, not sure, but what he's saying is somehow there has to be this separation between the man and what he believes. The man and the truth of Christianity. As a ruler, he's not called a Christian, but a prince. The man is a Christian, but his function does not concern his religion. I'm personally opposed, but where does that come from? Luther, right? Right. So the president, the members of Congress, they're just Protestants, right? They're not Catholic. The minute you say I'm personally opposed, but you're a Protestant. Yeah, he's just Luther, right? It's just Luther. It's just a recycle of Luther. The problem is that it's baked into America, right? That idea is baked into America, which we're going to talk about. Yes, Aaron.
Not Catholic, but I'm interpreting that's wrong, like you can't legislate something. That's
Yeah, well, it's already predicated on where's the Supreme Court? Like, the Supreme Court is not the Supreme Court, right? Like, it's misnamed because it makes it seem like they don't have to answer to anyone, that there's no one above. And what happened is, I mean, just kind of baked into a little bit of the founding, right? There's enough of the natural law to make it sort of sit for a little bit. But then when people cease to be virtuous and believe the natural law, then suddenly they become the supreme authority and there's nothing over the Constitution, right? Whereas the way it's supposed to be set up is no matter what, the church is over the state. So ultimately, the moral authority rests with the church. Now, the church wouldn't rule, and they wouldn't make decisions or laws, but they would most certainly say that law is contrary to the faith, get it out. Or they would say to a ruler, this is why, like, historically, right, when a ruler was excommunicated, Catholics were free to go. They didn't have to believe them. They didn't have to listen to the ruler anymore. That's why every ruler was like, I don't want to push the Pope that far, because now they don't. Yes. Yeah, I mean, there were times where like it was blurred, or there were times where the church might concede, like the power to, select bishops. Ultimately, the church ordained. Maybe sometimes the state had a say in who the bishops were going to be, but ultimately, it's the church who decides who they're going to be. Where was I going with that? Okay, so the that personally opposed but comes from Luther. I had a thought that I was going to share, and hopefully it'll come back up. Okay, so the idea of popular sovereignty is the principle that the authority of the state are created and sustained by the consent of the people, governed by the consent of the people. If this is true, by the way, then democracy is the only just form of government, by the way. Right? Because only if the people vote is that legitimate. Now, St. Thomas would say that people have the right to choose their rulers, but their authority doesn't come from the people. It still comes from God. God just used the people to elect the rulers. Yes.
They have the right, or it's not wrong if they do it?
They could. Sorry. They have the right. Like, it's not a strict right, but they could do it. Right. There's nothing wrong with it. Right. So they can designate. How the rulers are designated doesn't matter, like, in a certain sense. Right. But once the ruler exercises their authority, it comes from above, not from below. Okay. So in free governments, the rulers are the servants and the people are their superiors and their sovereigns. What's wrong with that? It's flipped upside down, right? Who is in free governments, right? The rulers are the superiors and sovereigns. Legitimate governments are chosen deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. So again, from below, not from above.
Wait, Rob, if the rulers are the, on top, when Jesus like directs his disciples to serve at like the Last Supper, he talks to them about being like the servant of all. How does that relate?
Yeah, so in that respect, right? So he's not talking about how they should exercise their authority in the church. He's talking about their personal dispositions, right? And there is a servant ruler or a servant leader is still a servant ruler, servant. He's still a leader, right? Even though he may have a spirit of service, right? So does that make sense?
Okay, yeah, I think the spirit of service.
Yeah, I mean, that can be like my authority, right, as a father ought to be exercised with a spirit of service to my wife and my children. And yet, nevertheless, it doesn't. My authority comes directly from God, not from the fact that my kids really like me. As if they're, and this is why, by the way, part of the reason why Marxists hate the family is because it's almost impossible to undo the hierarchical structure of the family, and they hate hierarchy. Right? They like anarchy, not hierarchy. All right, third verse where Christ talks about temporal governments. They came and said to him, "Teacher, we know that you are a truthful man, that you are concerned with anyone's opinion. You do not regard a person's status, but teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. Is it lawful to pay the census tax to Caesar or not? Should we pay or should we not pay?" Knowing their hypocrisy, he said to them, Why are you testing me? Bring me a denarius to look at it. They brought one to him, and he said to them, Whose image and inscription is this? They replied to him, Caesar's. So Jesus said to them, Repay to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God. And they were utterly amazed at him. Okay, what does that mean? What does he mean? What do we owe to Caesar and what do we owe to God? Yes. Well, is tribute rendered to an earthly leader? Depends, I guess, what you mean by tribute, but what I think you mean by tribute. Like, what do you mean by tribute?
Because I was meaning in terms of taxes, like you're paying to God in a way indirectly. But you're
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, so let's sort of unpack this by now examining separation of church and state, and then we'll make it specific to America in a minute. So the idea of separation of church and state is not something that Thomas Jefferson just made up whole cloth in 1803 in a letter to the Danbury Baptists. Instead, it was a principle that already animated the church. Right? Pope Gelasius in 494 said, Christ, mindful of human fragility, had discerned between the functions of each power. His reason for so doing was twofold. On the one hand, it is written that no warring for God should be entangled with secular things. The reason d'etre of the royal power was to relieve the clerics of the burden of having to care for their carnal and material wants, for the temporal necessities. The pontiffs indeed need the emperors so that they can devote themselves to their functions properly and are not distracted by the pursuit of these carnal matters. But the emperors, Christian as they are, need the pontiffs for the achievement of eternal salvation. All right, so let's see if we can glean some Catholic principles about the relationship between church and state from what he said. All right, first, give me a principle that's in that. And then we can compare it to, everyone sort of gets the Catholic principle, right? Or at least the way it's lived out now, right? Where those two things are completely and totally separated. And in being separated, well, we'll just leave it at that. And then we can talk about the, okay, so what principles is he sort of laying out here? So first, who's in charge ultimately? Right? So he says the reason for the royal power is to relieve the clerics of burden of having to care for their carnal and material wants. Okay, so there's a certain primacy. And even the emperors, Christian as they are, need the pontiffs for the achievement of eternal salvation. All right, so again, the state exists in a certain respect beneath the church. Yes.
So, I was going to ask about this. Yeah, so there is implied in there kind of like the apostles of saying, like, we're going to ordain deacons because we should be able to do more important things. We're going to assign lesser things to you. There's the idea of like, well, we really have the Pope, really, I guess, as Christ, like the steward of the kingdom, really does have power over every single kingdom. And so I don't know a ton about it. I know in the past there was like the two swords theory, or basically kind of like the church had all the power, we're just lending it to you. So that's true in the sense that the church is saying, well, we're going to take.
But yeah, that's the idea with Peter, like with the two swords, right? When he picks up the two swords, that's where that comes from. But so no, that's not what that necessarily means, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that all power flows through the church. right? This is why like the body, like the body is a good, or the person is a good sort of image, right? So soul and body, right? One thing, is there a primacy in one of them? Soul, right? Okay. So is the body then to be neglected? No, right? But when body and soul conflict, so in other words, you know, can I use my body to sin because I need something? No, right? Because the damage it does to your soul versus the damage you do to your body, right? So that primacy, that what happens though when you separate body and soul? Death, right? So what happens when you separate church and state? Same thing, right? So in a certain regard, they are separate only insofar as their mode of operation, but they're dependent upon each other the way body and soul are. Yes.
So I just to so it comes together. The joining point, the root of this tree is Christ, not the Pope.
Right. Yeah. The Christ is the one, and he delegates his authority to two different. Think of it in just to make it simple, two different people. Right. So he delegates his spiritual power to the Pope, and he delegates his temporal power to the king. And he does, because the spiritual has a primacy, he gives the Pope the power to of infallibility.
And so does the authority in that case come, I guess, does the authority come more so from the fact that the church is the one given the authority to rule upon moral questions which bind all people regardless of their status in the world?
Yes. Yes. Oh, I know what I was going to say about the Pope being able to excommunicate leaders, right? And how that unbinds Catholics from obeying those leaders, right? Don't think that there is some trepidation on the fact, there's some trepidation of excommunicating politicians for that reason, by the way. So the reason why certain people might hesitate to excommunicate, say, our president for his beliefs is precisely because I am no longer bound in conscience to obey him, no matter what he says, true or not, right? As a Catholic. So don't think that doesn't somehow come into the train of thought of why maybe like blatantly excommunicating him might actually cause more evil, bring about a worse end than that. I mean, if all the Catholics were to obey the church in that, so chances are they wouldn't, right? And that opens up a whole new can of worms. And so literally I would be obligated not to obey the president if he was excommunicated, for example.
What is he? I guess what does he need to obligate to?
Well, yeah, okay, so that yeah, I guess obligated was the wrong word to use there. I am commanded no longer to obey him, but insofar as like I still have to obey the natural law, like all of those things, right? So it's not, but I no longer, for example, I wouldn't have to pay taxes. I would no longer be obligated to pay taxes. Yes. Yeah, yes. Yeah. Yeah, it's hard. Like it would have to be a formal excommunication. Yes.
But I guess you don't have to mess with it. You don't have to excommunicate before you know.
No, that's really kind of a different issue, right? Like, because not everyone who's in mortal sin, if you know publicly the person is in mortal sin, is excommunicated, right? They're in mortal sin. Okay. All right. So I think like on a level of principle, I think we have what we need to kind of look at America. So Leo the 13th wrote an encyclical on the Catholicity in America. And what I really want to to emphasize is the first sentence here. It would be very erroneous to draw the conclusion that in America is to be sought the type of the most desirable status of the church, or that it would be universally lawful or expedient for state and church to be as in America, dissevered and divorced. Okay, full stop. How many Catholics think that, including prelates, think that the way it is in America is the best? A lot, right? For sure, a lot. Okay, so admitting now that he said it's not the most desirable, what is the most desirable status of the church? Why does it have to be idealized? Why can't it just be the Holy Roman Empire? So talk about what that would mean. So I'm going to ask it because people are like, you can't have a theocracy. Is a confessional state the best thing? How many think yes? So a confessional state is when there is one church, right? There's one accepted religion, and that's it. Go ahead, Connor. Yeah. So is that the best situation? When the true church is the only church recognized? So yes. Why? Yeah, and because Christ is reigning in both, pulling in the same direction, and many souls will be saved because of it, right? State doesn't save souls, but certainly makes it way easier, right? When they're on the same page, right? When the moral law and the laws of the church are followed. So the next logical question is, well, then what happens to religious freedom in that setting? So let's just say, this great monarch comes, takes over the United States. The church is head of the, and everyone, let's not even go to everyone. The Catholic Church has made the church of the official church of the United States. What about religious freedom? Okay, so let's use it in the sense of, I have, in conscience, I have an obligation to follow the truth as I know it. Everyone agree? Okay, so let's use freedom in that respect. Right, so what about the Protestant who hasn't been evangelized? What about the Jew who hasn't been evangelized? What are they free to practice their religion? Yes.
You can't force conversions, but you can. So they were like, I'm going to go burn down the Catholic Church and get stop them from doing that.
Okay, so we all agree forced conversions, forced baptism is a bad idea. Totally. But what about the Jew who sincerely believes and wants to go to synagogue on Saturdays? What would you do in the confessional state?
Stop them, but you also wouldn't have to give, I don't think you'd have to give like advantages to, for instance, like tax exempt status, you wouldn't have to give tax exempt status to non-Catholic religion.
Okay, so you wouldn't necessarily have to give them benefits, but if you don't stop them, aren't you sliding towards religious neutrality? We all agree religious neutrality is a bad idea, right? Because what that says is actually there is no true religion, whatever you want. So we want to stay away from religion. We want to stay away from the state being religiously neutral.
Like, I can't force you, but I can at least, if you haven't been evangelized, take me time to evangelize and to teach and at least present it.
Okay, so you could you could pin them down in a chair and put formed on for 24 hours and make them watch it to catechize them. So yes, evangelizing, assuming that that's the case. But what do we do about the Jew who sincerely believes that the Jewish faith is true? What do we do about them? And because they have religious obligations, do they have a right to have a synagogue? Thanks, Aaron. Let's use Protestantism since it's cleaner, and we'll come back to that because there is an answer for that question. Does a Protestant have a right to build a Protestant church?
All right? No. Are you allowed to stop them?
Well, hold on. Don't make that distinction yet. But well, if they don't have a right to it and it harms the common good, then you could stop them. So let's just start with the right question first. Do they have a right to build a church? Okay. Error doesn't have rights. What does that mean? Where there is no truth, there is no right. Okay, you don't have a right to something that isn't true. So what do we do with them?
This is where I think the distinction is important because I think it's one thing to say error doesn't have rights in the sense you couldn't petition the government and say, well, you need to build a church. But on the other hand, if some private Protestant entrepreneur said, I'm going to build, first whatever church, I think it would be a different step to say, okay, well, I'm not going to prevent you from doing that.
What about the other people that they're leading into error by building that church?
That's it. Because obviously, taking it to another extreme, which is really only a gradient. It's like I wouldn't allow Church of Satanism.
For sure.
That's not. Maybe it's a difference in kind. It's a gradient. It's still they're both wrong. Just different degrees. So in that case,
so what if you limited their ability to publicly express their religion? Is that legit? So in other words, if you want to worship, that's fine. You like making your garage into a church anyway. Go for it. But is that permissible? Permissible, yes. Necessary, no. Right. So you could completely and totally shut off any public display of religion that's not Catholic. Now, classically and traditionally, that's not what has happened. The state, in prudence, can tolerate certain expressions, right? Because if, for example, if I completely shut down the Protestant expression, this Protestant expression of religion, and I know they're zealots and they're going to blow things up, right? I might go, you know what? For the sake of peace, which is part of the common good, I might be willing to tolerate them building a church off in the woods somewhere. Then they can do what they want there. All right. So it doesn't completely shut down expression, but we have to start from the principle they have no right to worship falsely. But the state might, in deference to the common good, allow certain expressions to happen. Okay. And again, that happened in Christendom, right? Like that happened in France. But when tolerance becomes a policy, that's where you get into trouble, right? Where tolerance becomes no matter what, we have to tolerate it versus tolerating it on a certain level, okay? Now, to Judaism, right? The expression of Judaism. It is a true religion, but incomplete. And because the church has completed it in that regard, and it claims it has not been completed, it's false. So you would treat it the same way as the others. Yes. Because in a certain respect, right, Protestantism also isn't completely and totally false, right? Just different, different aspects of it, but both are an error.
So, so I guess it's very clear in these examples, like you take, say, like Satanism. We see that now where people are like, well, abortion is part of my religion because of Satanism. Therefore, you see why total religious tolerance doesn't work, because you eventually get people who will abuse it, or even the people who want to abuse it, they have horrible beliefs. Is the only difference between like Protestantism, normally it's going to be a little bit hard to get people to say, okay, it's going to be hard to get the general public to say, yeah, we're not going to allow Protestants or something like that. It's basically the only difference between those two in the sense that it's more okay to say, okay, we will tolerate Protestantism, where it's not okay to say we're going to tolerate Satanism. That just you allow it more because it's probably closer.
But yes, for sure, right? But it would also be, it would be either way, it has to be very clear, made very clear that Protestantism is false, even though these people are doing it.
Yeah, I guess what I'm trying to get is there's probably in all those.
Yeah, not on, so you're tolerating a less, like Protestantism would be a lesser evil than Satanism, right?
Same-sex marriage or abortion are things that are okay, or at least permissible. Would that go into the, like, no, we're gonna draw the line there, show you on, this is different?
I don't think, like, I think you have to tolerate the whole package, but again, you're not giving them any opportunity to publicly express their beliefs anyway, right? So yes, are they corrupting, like parents corrupting their children? Yes, but parents have proper authority over their children. And, you know, for the state to intervene, there has to be a grave evil going on, right? Okay, so there is actually a heresy called Americanism, which is pretty cool. We live in a country that has a heresy named after it. It's pretty awesome. It's the movement propagated in the United States in the late 19th century, which claimed that the Catholic Church should adjust its doctrines, especially the morality, to the culture of the people, emphasizing the active virtues of social welfare and democratic equality. It underrated the passive virtues of humility and obedience to ecclesiastical authority. Okay, so what is it? It essentially takes the principles of America, especially of religious liberty, and turns them into a universal principle. Okay, so the idea that all religions are equal, that's this heresy, right? I can't enforce my religious beliefs on other people. That's this heresy, right? When I say, again, like the personally opposed, but is really just, I believe this, but I have no right to impose it on other people. That's this heresy. It's really in a certain sense, it's all over the place, like probably as prevalent as the Arian heresy was. And the scary part is, like, most, you guys know Arian heresy, right? From like the 4th century, it's a heresy about Christ, about the hypostatic union, about Christ being fully God and fully man. So the Arian heresy specifically attacked Christ's divinity. If you hear someone say something like, Christ wasn't born divine, he figured it out, or he got it sometime later, that's all Arianism. Okay. The problem with Arianism, which was the biggest threat to the church, was that a ton of people were Arian and didn't even know it, because it had so infected the thought that people didn't even know it. They had no idea that they believed what was heretical, right? And in fact, at the time, 2/3 of the bishops were Arians, which is a big number, right? And St. John Henry Newman, in his book on the Arian heresy, actually talks about how it was the laity that kept the church together. That and St. Athanasius, who kept getting banished. So he works out a great explanation of the two natures of Christ, and he keeps getting banished out of his see. And what they unwittingly did was kept sending him all over the world, and he's teaching it. Right. And so the expression Athanasius contra mundi, Athanasius against the world, one man kept the church going, because they kept sending, first they sent him to the East, then all the Eastern Catholics began to learn, like, the truth about Christ. Then they're like, okay, next time we'll just send him to Rome. And then he went and infected the Vatican and the cardinals there. And then they sent him north, and then they sent him south. And all the time they're thinking, well, this is, we just keep banishing him. He was banished like 18 times from his apostolic see. And he just went and he just kept teaching. And he, like, that's why he's a saint, but that's why he kept the church together. But it was mostly because the laity actually kept the faith, the truth of Christ. Okay, so what Americanism then does is essentially takes the idea that all religions are equal as long as someone's sincere and makes it somehow Catholic idea. And again, we see this not just in America, but we see it affecting the church. And then the idea of adapting teachings to the spirit of the age. That's what the people who hijacked Vatican II did, right? They took it and they adapted it to the spirit of the age. Father James Martin is an Americanist. You just want to know how you label him. You label him heretic, and he is an Americanist. Trying to think about what else I can say about Americanism. Yeah, I mean, so it's a little, I mean, it's really modernism in a lot of ways, right? I think the habit of dialogue also comes out of this, right? Because when dialogue becomes a principle, right? When a Catholic and a Protestant are talking about the faith, is it really possible for them to dialogue? Yeah, well, dialogue makes it seem like, the term makes it seem like we're searching for the truth together, or that somehow the truth is somewhere in the middle, right? So when we talk about the faith, we have the high ground, right? We have the high ground, and we need to act like that. That's not a statement of like arrogance at all. That's just a fact that carries an obligation to preach the faith. Like we're obligated because of that, because we have the faith to convert, right? That all comes from Americanism, that spirit of dialogue. It's impossible to dialogue with someone who's wrong, right? That's just the reality. And what that ends up doing is it's just the reverse of like plurality, religious plurality, right? It just treats everything, people come, dialogue leads to indifference, right? Because why am I going to dialogue if it's okay what they believe? Why does it matter? Why would I bother trying to move the person closer to the truth if really what they believe, they're fine anyway, as long as they're sincere about it. So that's all of that has to go. Right? Like, and again, we can be way gentle in talking to people about the faith, but the minute you look for, dialogue or common ground, you see this like with even just simple things that we do, right? Like when people are like, a Protestant goes, well, where's that in the Bible? And like the first thing you should say is like, well, actually, where is it in the Bible that it has to be in the Bible, right? Like you have to go to the first principle and move them back, instead of trying to go, okay, well, it's here in the Bible. And they're like, well, that's not how I interpret. Like, see what you did? You just got yourself in the trap because you gave away a Catholic principle. And you got yourself in a trap where they're like, well, I don't interpret it that way, and I'm the supreme interpreter, right? That's the danger of dialogue. You will never get the person moved to the truth.
Would it just depend on do that in a way that would be loving and like
Obviously not as bluntly as I just did it. Like that was not a good tactic, but certainly to go, well, hold on a second. Like, why does it have to be in the Bible? I mean, that's the gentle way to do it, right? Like, no, do not learn from my like 37-second, do it this way. Yeah. How to Win Friends and Influence People by Rob McNally. No, like, yes, be very gentle, like, because you're on sacred ground, right? Like this is really important. So like, you don't want your approach to be the thing that turns them off, right? You want to get them to the truth, and then they have to make a decision. So yeah, do not do it the way I just said. But I mean, personally, I've found the questioning route the best way, like just a gentle question that usually, see, here's the thing, right? So when you find common ground with someone, that's good. But what you really need to do is get them off the common ground behind where the mistake is, right? Because they're wrong all the way up to the common ground. And so, yeah, investigating where your common ground is, so you know where you have to move the person from, but you still got to get back to the place where they went off the road to begin with.
That may not be part of it, but there can be, is there there could be some legitimate to saying like, look, this actually does, even if you work it out your way, even if you work it out from kind of the scripture first drafts, you still end up with the kind of like your route doesn't even, your beliefs don't even make sense from your own test. And in fact, even the basis of your beliefs don't even make sense from your own test.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you can, like, once you've established that's a principle, if you want to go back to the principle where it's in the Bible, fine. But eventually you're going to have to say, I think I've shared this, like a group of guys at my work, a bunch of Protestants, I decided to go to their Bible study. And it was funny because after this is probably a year of going like every Wednesday, a new guy came in and I said something Catholic. I don't even remember what it was. And 3 of the guys in the group argued against him. I didn't even say a word after, like, to defend it. And they're like, no, that's not what Catholics believe. And they just went like all the way through, right? And because they started to understand, like, I took a lot of time to get them there, right? And they started to understand it. And one of the guys, like, his only obstacle was his parents would kill him if he converted to Catholicism. That's a real thing, right? Like, I can't remove that obstacle. Like, why should I continue to beat him up about it? So we just talked about stuff we agreed on. I would remind him again, like, what Catholic, I keep telling him, well, this is, where we disagree. So all of that, like, that gentleness is really, really important. Because ultimately, right, like, this is where the truth is subjective, in the sense of you will only actually grasp the truth from someone if you trust them. Right. And so all of the things those are really, really important. And then that's like the hard apologetics and the hard that technique of just like going for the kill doesn't work. At least I've never had any success in it. Maybe I'm not good at it, but the times I've done it, I've looked like a total jerk, and not moments I'm like proud of. Okay, last slide. All right, so politics as evangelization. Catholics should extend their efforts beyond this restricted sphere, that is, and pay attention and give their attention to national politics. Nevertheless, as we have laid down, to take no share in public matters would be as wrong as to have no concern for or to bestow no labor upon the common good. You see, he took it to the level of the common good. And the more so because Catholics are admonished by the very doctrines which they profess to be upright and faithful in discharge of duty, while if they hold aloof men whose principles offer but small guarantee for the welfare of the state, will the more readily seize the reins of government. For in so doing, they assume not, nor should they assume the responsibility of approving what is blameworthy in the actual methods of government, but seek to turn these very methods, so far as is possible, to the genuine and true public good, and to use their best endeavors at the same time to infuse, as it were, into all the veins of the state, the healthy sap and blood of Christian wisdom and virtue. All right, questions?
So this seems to kind of be getting to how much can you work inside the system